There is a book locked in a vault at Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library that has been studied by some of the most brilliant minds in the history of cryptography. The same codebreakers who cracked the Enigma machine, the same mathematicians who built the foundations of modern computing, the same intelligence agencies that deciphered enemy communications during 2 world wars, and not one of them has been able to read a single word of it. The book is 240 pages long. It is written on vellum, calfskin parchment, in a flowing, confident hand. Its pages are filled with text in an unknown script, arranged in neat paragraphs and columns, accompanied by elaborate illustrations of plants that do not exist, astronomical diagrams that do not correspond to any known celestial system, and naked human figures bathing in networks of interconnected tubes and pools that resemble nothing in any medical or anatomical tradition. The writing is consistent from beginning to end. The letter forms are uniform. The word spacing is regular. The text has all the visual characteristics of a real language, written by a real author, for a real purpose. It looks, at first glance, like a perfectly ordinary medieval manuscript, the kind of book a physician or an herbalist might have produced in the 15th century. It is not ordinary. It is by a wide margin the most studied and least understood manuscript in human history. The book is called the Voynich Manuscript, named after the Polish-Lithuanian book dealer Wilfrid Voynich, who purchased it from a collection of Jesuit manuscripts in 1912. Its origins are obscure, its author is unknown. Its language, if it is a language, has never been identified. Its script, if it is a script, has never been deciphered. Its illustrations, if they are illustrations of real things, have never been matched to any known flora, fauna, or cosmological system. Every element of the manuscript resists identification. Every aspect of its content defies explanation. It is, in the truest and most unsettling sense, a book that no one can read. The numbers are striking. Since its rediscovery in 1912, the Voynich manuscript has been subjected to more than 100 serious attempts at decipherment. Professional cryptographers, amateur codebreakers, linguists, historians, botanists, astronomers, and computer scientists have all tried. The manuscript has been analyzed using frequency analysis, statistical pattern recognition, neural networks, Markov models, and every other technique in the modern cryptanalytic toolkit. It has been the subject of hundreds of scholarly papers, dozens of books, and at least 3 major academic conferences. It has been digitized, transcribed, and made freely available online, allowing anyone with an internet connection and an interest in puzzles to take a crack at it. The result of all this effort is precisely nothing. No confirmed reading of a single word, no identification of the language, no explanation of the illustrations, no consensus on whether the text is meaningful at all. After more than a century of sustained scholarly assault, the Voynich manuscript remains exactly as opaque as the day Wilfrid Voynich pulled it from a dusty chest in an Italian villa and held it up to the light. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why. You are going to learn what the Voynich manuscript contains, where it came from, who might have written it, and why every attempt to decode it has failed. You are going to confront the possibility that the book's real secret may not be its content but its purpose, that the Voynich manuscript may be not a code waiting to be cracked but something far stranger and far more unsettling, a book that was designed, from its first page to its last, to be impossible to read, a book that is its own mystery, a book that answers every question with another question and every solution with a deeper puzzle. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let us begin. The physical object itself is the first mystery. The Voynich manuscript, catalogued as MS-408 at Yale's Beinecke Library, consists of approximately 240 pages of vellum, organized into gatherings or quires in the traditional medieval manner. The pages measure roughly 16 centimeters by 23 centimeters, a little larger than a modern paperback. Some pages fold out to reveal larger diagrams, including several elaborate circular charts and one extraordinary multi-panel illustration that, when fully unfolded, spans 6 pages and depicts what appears to be an interconnected system of baths, pools, and channels populated by dozens of small naked female figures. The vellum is genuine. Radiocarbon dating, conducted in 2009 by researchers at the University of Arizona, established with 95% confidence that the vellum was produced between 1404 and 1438, firmly within the early 15th century. This dating applies to the vellum itself, not to the ink or the text. In principle, the text could have been written at any time after the vellum was prepared, but analysis of the ink, conducted using a variety of techniques including infrared spectroscopy and X-ray fluorescence, has shown that it is consistent with medieval iron gall ink, the standard writing medium of the period. The ink shows no evidence of modern chemical compounds. It has penetrated the vellum in a manner consistent with having been applied when the vellum was relatively new. The convergence of the radiocarbon date and the ink analysis makes it overwhelmingly probable that the manuscript was written in the early to mid-15th century, roughly the same period as the early Renaissance, the fall of Constantinople, and the invention of the printing press. This dating is important because it eliminates a large category of explanations. The Voynich Manuscript is not a modern forgery. It is not a product of the 19th century occult revival. It is not a hoax perpetrated by Wilfrid Voynich himself, as some early skeptics suggested. It is a genuine medieval artifact, produced on genuine medieval materials, in a genuine medieval hand, at a time when Europe was in the midst of one of the most intellectually turbulent periods in its history. Whatever the manuscript is, it was created by someone who lived in the 15th century, who had access to substantial quantities of expensive vellum, who possessed significant skill in calligraphy and illustration, and who invested an enormous amount of time and effort in the production of a book that, if it is a hoax, was never shown to anyone and never used for any identifiable purpose. The cost of the manuscript is itself a clue. Vellum was expensive in the 15th century. A single leaf required the skin of a calf. The 240-page manuscript would have required roughly 120 calfskins, a significant investment of material. The illustrations are elaborate, involving multiple colors of pigment. The text is extensive, approximately 170,000 characters, depending on how the characters are counted. The total labor involved, the preparation of the vellum, the ruling of the lines, the writing of the text, the painting of the illustrations, would have represented months of full-time work by a skilled craftsman. This is not the kind of effort that one undertakes casually. The manuscript's creator, whoever it was committed to the project. The question is, committed to what? The earliest confirmed owner of the manuscript is Georg Baresch, an obscure alchemist living in Prague in the early 17th century. Baresch, who had apparently been trying to decipher the manuscript for years, wrote a letter in 1639 to the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher in Rome, describing a mysterious book filled with unknown writing and illustrations of plants that he could not identify. Baresch sent samples of the script to Kircher, hoping that the famous scholar, who claimed to have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs, a claim that was later shown to be entirely wrong, could make sense of it. There is no surviving record of Kircher's response, but the manuscript eventually found its way into the collection of Jan Marek Marci, rector of the University of Prague, who sent it to Kircher in 1666, with a cover letter that has become one of the most important documents in the manuscript's history. Marci's letter contains a crucial claim. He writes that the manuscript had previously been owned by Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire, who ruled from Prague between 1576 and 1612. Rudolf was a famous collector of curiosities, a patron of astrologers and alchemists, and a man whose court attracted some of the most brilliant and eccentric minds in Europe. Marci further claims that Rudolf paid 600 ducats for the manuscript, an enormous sum, equivalent to roughly the price of a large house. If this claim is true, it tells us two things. First, that the manuscript was already old and mysterious by Rudolf's time, and second, that someone, the seller, presented it as a work of genuine value, worth a royal fortune. Marcy's letter also contains a second claim, that the manuscript was believed to have been written by Roger Bacon, the 13th century English Franciscan friar, who was one of the earliest proponents of experimental science in the Western world. The Bacon attribution was taken seriously for decades. Wilfrid Voynich himself believed it, but it has been effectively ruled out by the radiocarbon dating. The vellum dates to the early 15th century. Bacon died in 1292, unless the text was copied onto new vellum from a Bacon-era original, a possibility that cannot be absolutely excluded, but for which no evidence exists. Bacon did not write the Voynich Manuscript. After Kircher received the manuscript, it disappeared from the historical record for over 2 centuries. It resurfaced in 1912 when Wilfrid Voynich, a Lithuanian-born antiquarian book dealer with a colourful history that included imprisonment in Siberia for revolutionary activities and an escape that reads like a spy novel, discovered it among a collection of manuscripts being sold by the Jesuit order at the Villa Mondragone near Frascati, Italy. Voynich immediately recognized the manuscript as extraordinary. He spent the remaining years of his life trying to promote it, to arrange for its decipherment, and to identify its author. He failed on all 3 counts. After his death in 1930, the manuscript passed through several hands before being donated to Yale University in 1969, where it remains today. The manuscript's content is organized into what scholars have identified as several distinct sections, based on the types of illustrations that accompany the text. The categorization is conventional and somewhat arbitrary. The manuscript itself contains no section headings, chapter divisions, or any other form of internal organization visible to the reader, but it provides a useful framework for discussion. Before examining those sections, however, the provenance, the chain of ownership, deserves closer attention because it is one of the few aspects of the manuscript that connects it to identifiable historical figures and events. The trail of evidence, sparse as it is, anchors the manuscript in a specific historical context. The intellectual world of late medieval and early modern Central Europe, a world of alchemists, astrologers, herbalists, and natural philosophers who operated at the boundary between empirical observation and esoteric speculation. Wilfrid Voynich claimed to have found a letter tucked inside the manuscript's pages when he purchased it. The letter, from Jan Marek Marci to Athanasius Kircher, dated 1666, provides the earliest documented account of the manuscript's history. Marci writes that he is sending the book which my friend Dr. Raphael left to me by will, and notes the tradition that Rudolf II purchased it. The doctor referred to is believed to be Raphael Nischowski, a friend of Marci's and a noted Prague intellectual. Nischowski, according to Marci, was the source of the claim that Roger Bacon was the author. The Prague connection is significant. Rudolf II's court at Prague was one of the most intellectually adventurous and most credulous in European history. Rudolf collected everything: paintings, sculptures, scientific instruments, botanical specimens, and manuscripts. His court attracted scholars, charlatans, and everything in between. The English magus John Dee and his associate Edward Kelly both spent time at Rudolf's court. Dee was a genuine polymath, a mathematician, astronomer, and cartographer of the first rank, who also claimed to communicate with angels through crystal gazing. Kelly was an alchemist of dubious reputation, who claimed to be able to transmute base metals into gold. Both had connections to the world of esoteric manuscripts, and both have been proposed as possible authors or previous owners of the Voynich manuscript, though the evidence for either connection is circumstantial at best. The presence of the manuscript in Prague also places it in a city that was, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, one of the intellectual capitals of Europe, a centre of astronomical research, alchemical experimentation, and the kind of boundary-crossing scholarship that produced some of the greatest advances of the scientific revolution, alongside some of the most elaborate frauds. Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler both worked in Prague under Rudolf's patronage. The same court that funded Kepler's laws of planetary motion also funded Kelly's alchemical experiments. The line between genius and charlatanism was, in Rudolf's Prague, extraordinarily thin. The Voynich manuscript, with its air of profound but impenetrable learning, would have fit perfectly into this environment. After its Jesuit period, during which the manuscript apparently sat unexamined in the library of the Collegium Romanum for roughly 2 centuries, and its rediscovery by Voynich in 1912, the manuscript became one of the most famous puzzles in the world. Voynich himself, a charismatic and self-promoting figure, worked tirelessly to generate interest in the manuscript. He corresponded with scholars, exhibited the manuscript at public events, and actively sought someone who could decipher it. His wife, Ethel Lillian Voynich, herself a notable figure, the author of the best-selling novel The Gadfly, continued the effort after his death. The manuscript passed through the hands of the dealer Hans P. Krauss, who attempted to sell it for $160,000 in the 1960s without finding a buyer, before finally donating it to Yale in 1969. At Yale, the manuscript became accessible to scholars for the first time in a systematic way, and the modern era of Voynich research began. The Beinecke Library's decision to digitize the manuscript and make high-resolution images freely available online transformed the field, opening the manuscript to analysis by anyone with a computer and an internet connection. The result has been an explosion of proposed solutions and a corresponding explosion of refuted solutions. The democratization of access has not produced a breakthrough. It has produced more failure, distributed more widely. The first section, which occupies roughly the first 112 pages, is called the herbal or botanical section. It consists of pages depicting individual plants, each accompanied by a block of text. The plants are drawn in a style that is broadly consistent with medieval herbal illustration, a central stem, leaves, flowers, and roots. But with a critical difference: the plants do not correspond to any known species. This is not a matter of artistic stylization. Medieval herbals frequently depict plants in stylized or schematic forms that bear only a general resemblance to the real thing. But the plants in the Voynich manuscript are not stylized versions of real plants. They appear to be inventions, composite creatures assembled from the parts of different plants, or perhaps depictions of plants that exist only in the imagination of the artist. Some have roots that resemble human faces. Others have flowers that look like nothing in any known botanical record. A few bear a passing resemblance to real species. Scholars have tentatively identified possible sunflowers, ferns, and water lilies. But these identifications are disputed and depend on generous interpretation of highly ambiguous drawings. The second section is called the astronomical or cosmological section. It contains circular diagrams that appear to depict celestial objects, suns, moons, and stars arranged in concentric rings, sometimes with text labels. Some of these diagrams bear a general resemblance to medieval zodiacal charts, and a few contain symbols that have been tentatively identified as zodiac signs. But the resemblance is superficial. The specific configurations, the number and arrangement of stars, and the overall design of the diagrams do not match any known astronomical tradition. Not Western, not Islamic, not Chinese, not Indian. The third section is called the biological or balneological section, from the Latin word for bathing. It is the strangest part of the manuscript. It depicts dozens of small naked female figures. Most scholars refer to them as nymphs, immersed in or connected to elaborate networks of pools, tubes, and channels, some of which appear to be filled with coloured liquid. The figures are drawn in a consistent style, with round bodies, small heads, and flowing hair. They seem to be engaged in some kind of activity involving the liquid. Bathing, perhaps, or undergoing some kind of treatment. The purpose and meaning of these illustrations have defied every attempt at interpretation. They do not correspond to any known medical, alchemical, or cosmological tradition of the medieval period. They are, like the plants and the star charts, without parallel. The fourth section is called the pharmaceutical section. It contains drawings of small containers, jars, vials, and vessels, alongside what appear to be plant parts, arranged in a manner that suggests pharmaceutical recipes or prescriptions. The text in this section is organized into short paragraphs, each associated with a specific illustration, in a format that is broadly consistent with medieval pharmacopoeias. But once again, the specific contents, the plants, the preparations, the combinations, do not correspond to any known pharmacological tradition. The fifth and final section consists of pages of text with no illustrations, or with only minimal decorative elements. This section has been interpreted as a recipe section, a glossary, or a theoretical treatise depending on the scholar. Without the ability to read the text, any interpretation is speculative. The text itself, the undeciphered writing that fills every page, is the heart of the mystery. The Voynich script consists of approximately 20 to 30 distinct characters, depending on how the characters are segmented and counted. This number is consistent with an alphabet, a writing system in which each character represents a single sound. It is not consistent with a syllabary, which would require 40 to 90 characters, or a logographic system, which would require hundreds or thousands. If the Voynich script is a genuine writing system, it is almost certainly alphabetic. The exact number of characters is itself a matter of scholarly debate, and the debate reveals something fundamental about the difficulty of working with unknown scripts. The problem is one of segmentation, determining where one character ends and another begins. In familiar scripts, segmentation is trivial. We know where the letter A ends and the letter B begins because we have learnt the boundaries. In an unknown script, the boundaries are not given. A single Voynich character might actually be two characters written closely together, or two apparently separate characters might actually be a single complex character. Different scholars have produced different character inventories, ranging from as few as 19 to as many as 40, depending on how they resolve these ambiguities. The most widely used transcription system, developed by the team of René Zandbergen and others using the European Voynich alphabet, identifies approximately 25 core characters, plus a number of rare variants. The segmentation problem is not trivial. If the number of characters is at the lower end, closer to 20, then the script is very likely an alphabet recording a language with a relatively small phonemic inventory. If the number is at the higher end, closer to 40, then the script might be a syllabary, or an alphabet augmented with digraphs, or special characters, or something else entirely. The character count determines the type of writing system, and the type of writing system constrains the range of possible languages. Get the segmentation wrong, and every subsequent analysis is built on a false foundation. The characters are written with a fluency and consistency that strongly suggest a practiced hand. Someone who was accustomed to writing in this script, not someone who was laboriously constructing each character from a cipher table. The text flows. The letter forms are natural, with the kind of ligatures and abbreviations that develop organically when a writer uses a script habitually over time. The word spacing is regular. The line spacing is consistent. The overall visual impression is of a text written quickly and confidently by someone who knew exactly what they were writing. But what were they writing? The statistical properties of the text have been analysed exhaustively, and they present a picture that is deeply puzzling. The text exhibits a frequency distribution of characters that is consistent with natural language. Some characters are very common, others are rare, and the distribution follows a pattern broadly similar to what is observed in real languages. The word length distribution is also consistent with natural language, with most words being 3 to 7 characters long, and the text shows the phenomenon known as Zipf's law, a statistical regularity observed in all known natural languages, in which the frequency of a word is inversely proportional to its rank. The most common word is roughly twice as common as the second most common word, 3 times as common as the third, and so on. The Voynich text follows this pattern. These statistical properties suggest that the text is linguistically meaningful, that it encodes a real message in a real language. But other statistical properties point in the opposite direction. The text shows an unusually low level of entropy, a measure of the randomness or information density of a message. Real languages have a characteristic level of entropy, and the Voynich text falls below the range observed for any known European language. This could mean several things: that the text is in a non-European language with different structural properties, that it is encoded in a way that reduces entropy, or that it is meaningless. A string of characters that mimics the surface statistics of language without containing any actual information. There's also the peculiar behavior of what Voynich scholars call gallows characters, a small set of tall, ornate characters that appear intermittently throughout the text, rising above the normal character height, like the uprights of a fence. These gallows characters, typically 4 to 6 in number, depending on the classification system, behave differently from the other characters in several respects. They tend to appear at the beginnings of words or paragraphs. They are relatively rare compared to the other characters. They do not combine freely with all other characters, but show strong preferences for specific neighbours. Some scholars have interpreted the gallows characters as numerals, others as capital letters, others as determinatives, special characters that indicate the category of the following word without being pronounced. None of these interpretations has been confirmed. The behaviour of the gallows characters is one of the many micro-mysteries within the macro-mystery of the manuscript. They are too consistent to be random. They are too irregular to be systematic. They follow rules that can be described but not explained. They are, in miniature, exactly what the manuscript as a whole is in the large, a pattern that looks meaningful but yields no meaning. The question of whether the Voynich text is meaningful, whether it encodes a real message or is an elaborate hoax, is the fault line that runs through the entire history of Voynich scholarship. On one side are those who believe the text is genuine, a real message in a real language encoded in a cipher or written in a language that has not yet been identified. On the other side are those who believe it is a fabrication, a meaningless string of characters, cleverly designed to look like language, created for purposes that range from financial fraud to philosophical experiment. The debate has been raging for over a century, and neither side has achieved a decisive victory. And this is where the real mystery begins, because the Voynich manuscript is not just an undeciphered text, it is a text that resists decipherment in ways that are fundamentally different from every other undeciphered writing system in the world. Linear A cannot be read because the language is unknown. The Indus script cannot be read because the inscriptions are too short. The Voynich manuscript cannot be read because it does not behave like any known form of encrypted or encoded communication. It violates the rules, it breaks the patterns, it confounds the methods. It is, in a sense that goes beyond metaphor, a different kind of mystery, a mystery that does not merely lack a solution, but that seems to actively resist the very concept of solution. Something is wrong with our assumptions, and the wrongness goes deeper than anyone expected. The core problem with the Voynich manuscript is not that it cannot be deciphered, it is that it should have been deciphered decades ago, and it was not. To understand why this failure is so significant, you need to understand what modern cryptanalysis can do. The science of code breaking is one of the most powerful analytical disciplines in human history. It broke the German Enigma cipher during the Second World War, a cipher so complex that it had over 158 million possible settings. It broke the Japanese purple cipher. It broke Soviet diplomatic codes. It has broken every commercially available encryption system that has ever been deployed without a mathematically proven security guarantee. The techniques developed in the 20th century for breaking ciphers, frequency analysis, index of coincidence, Kasiski examination, brute force computational attacks, are so powerful and so well understood that no simple substitution cipher, no transposition cipher, and no polyalphabetic cipher of the kind that was available in the 15th century can resist them for more than a few hours. If the Voynich manuscript is encrypted in any cipher that was known or knowable in the 15th century, it should have been broken long ago. It has not been broken. The history of failed attempts is, in its own right, one of the most remarkable narratives in the history of intellectual inquiry. The first serious code-breaking effort was mounted in the 1940s by a team led by William Friedman, who was, by any standard, the greatest cryptanalyst of the 20th century. Friedman had broken the Japanese purple cipher, a feat that gave the United States critical intelligence during the Pacific War. He had established the field of modern cryptanalysis almost single-handedly, developing the statistical methods that became the foundation of signals intelligence. If anyone alive could break the Voynich manuscript, it was Friedman. Friedman assembled a team of expert codebreakers, veterans of wartime intelligence work, specialists in frequency analysis and pattern recognition, and set them to work on the manuscript. The team worked on the problem intermittently for over 2 decades. They produced detailed analyses of the manuscript's statistical properties. They identified many of the features that subsequent researchers would confirm: the Zipf's law distribution, the low entropy, the unusual word structure patterns. They explored and eliminated dozens of cipher hypotheses. They failed. Friedman himself, in his final years, privately expressed the belief that the manuscript was not a cipher at all, but a constructed artificial language, a synthetic linguistic system created by the author for the purpose of recording information in a way that could not be read by anyone who did not possess the key. This hypothesis, which Friedman considered but could not prove, anticipated the modern debate about whether the manuscript encodes a natural language, an artificial language, or no language at all. Friedman died in 1969 without having deciphered a single word. The artificial language hypothesis, the idea that the Voynich text records not a natural language but an invented one, has a long pedigree and considerable appeal. Constructed languages were a subject of genuine interest in the 15th century and the centuries that followed. Ramon Lull, the 13th century Catalan philosopher, developed an elaborate system of combinatorial logic, the Ars Magna, that used rotating disks to generate combinations of concepts, words, and arguments. Lull's system was not a language in the modern sense, but it was a mechanism for producing structured sequences of symbols that encoded logical relationships. The connection between Lull's combinatorial methods and the Voynich manuscript's apparent combinatorial word structure has been noted by several scholars, though no direct link has been established. In the 15th century itself, the period during which the manuscript was produced, the creation of artificial languages and scripts was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a practical concern. Diplomats, merchants, and scholars all had reasons to develop private scripts for confidential communication. The humanist Leon Battista Alberti, who invented the cipher disk around 1467, explicitly discussed the problem of creating secure communication systems in his De Componendi Cifris, one of the earliest known treatises on cryptography. The intellectual environment of 15th century Italy, where the manuscript was most likely produced, based on its physical characteristics, was one in which the invention of new scripts and new systems of symbolic communication was both technically feasible and culturally motivated. If the Voynich manuscript records a constructed language, a language invented by its creator for the purpose of private notation, then the failure of decipherment is explained not by the complexity of the cipher but by the absence of the key. A constructed language, by definition, has no community of speakers. It has no linguistic relatives. It obeys no known grammatical rules. It is whatever its creator decided it should be. Without a dictionary or a grammar, without the key that maps the symbols to their meanings, a constructed language is permanently opaque. It is a one-time pad of meaning, a system that can encode any message and that cannot be broken without the codebook. The analogy with the one-time pad, a cryptographic system that is mathematically proven to be unbreakable, is instructive. The one-time pad works by combining a message with a random key of equal length. The result is a ciphertext that is, without the key, indistinguishable from random noise. No amount of computational power can break a one-time pad, because the ciphertext contains no information about the key. A constructed language works similarly. The relationship between the symbols and their meanings is arbitrary, defined by the creator, and known only to the creator. Without the definitions, the symbols are noise. If this is what the Voynich manuscript is, a text in a constructed language whose key has been lost, then the manuscript is, in the strict mathematical sense, unbreakable, not merely undeciphered, unbreakable. The information required to read it was contained in a key that existed in the mind of the creator, was perhaps written on a separate document that has not survived, and is now permanently beyond recovery. This is a devastating conclusion. It means that the manuscript could contain anything, a medical treatise, a work of philosophy, a personal diary, a work of fiction, and we would never know. The content is there, encoded in the symbols, preserved on the vellum, physically present on every page. But it is semantically absent, locked behind a key that no longer exists, as inaccessible as if it had been destroyed. After Friedman, the manuscript attracted a succession of talented amateurs and credentialed professionals, each bringing new methods and new hypotheses. The medieval historian Robert Brumbaugh proposed in the 1970s that the manuscript was encrypted with a complex substitution cipher involving multiple alphabets. His proposed readings were internally inconsistent and were rejected by other scholars. The linguist Jacques Guy proposed in the 1990s that the Voynich script might record a tonal East Asian language, a language like Chinese or Vietnamese, in which the meaning of a syllable depends on the pitch at which it is spoken. Guy's proposal was creative but ultimately untestable, since no specific language was identified and no proposed readings were produced. The amateur codebreaker Leo Levitov proposed in 1987 that the manuscript was written in a pidgin version of Flemish and described the rituals of the Cathar heresy, a medieval religious movement suppressed by the Catholic Church. Levitov's reading was, by scholarly consensus, entirely unconvincing. It required such extensive manipulation of the character values and such creative interpretation of the text that virtually any meaning could be extracted from any page. But his books sold well, and his hypothesis persists in the popular imagination as one of the more colourful entries in the catalogue of Voynich theories. This fact is the single most important datum in the entire Voynich puzzle, and it eliminates a surprisingly large number of hypotheses. It eliminates simple substitution ciphers, in which each letter of the plaintext is replaced by a fixed symbol. These are trivially vulnerable to frequency analysis and would have been cracked within days of serious effort. It eliminates polyalphabetic ciphers, like the Vigenère cipher, which use multiple substitution alphabets in rotation. These were not invented until the 16th century, after the manuscript was created, and are in any case breakable using the Kasiski examination or the index of coincidence. It eliminates transposition ciphers, which rearrange the order of letters. These produce texts with frequency distributions identical to the plaintext language, and the Voynich text's frequency distribution does not match any known language. The elimination of these standard cipher types is important because it means that whatever the Voynich text is, it is not a product of any known medieval encryption method. This narrows the field to a small number of possibilities, each of which is problematic in its own way. The first possibility is that the text is written in a natural language using an unknown alphabet, that it is not encrypted at all, but simply written in a script that no one has recognized. This is plausible in principle. Many natural languages have been written in idiosyncratic or private scripts at various points in history. But if this were the case, the text should yield to standard linguistic analysis. Its statistical properties should match those of a known language or language family. Its word length distribution, character frequency, and entropy should fall within the ranges observed for natural languages. As noted above, some of these properties do match, but others do not. The entropy is too low, the word length distribution is too regular, the character repetition patterns are unusual, the text looks like language in some ways and unlike language in others. It sits in an uncanny valley between natural and artificial, too structured to be random, too regular to be natural, too complex to be a simple cipher, and too anomalous to be a straightforward script. The second possibility is that the text employs an encryption method that was far ahead of its time, a cipher so sophisticated that it was not reinvented until centuries later, and that remains unbreakable even today. This is theoretically possible, but historically improbable. The history of cryptography in the 15th century is well documented. The most advanced cipher in use was the simple substitution cipher, sometimes augmented with nulls, meaningless characters inserted to confuse frequency analysis. The Alberti cipher disk, generally considered the first polyalphabetic cipher device, was invented around 1467, within the possible date range of the manuscript but at the very end of it, and there is no evidence that it was widely adopted. The idea that a 15th century cryptographer independently invented a cipher method centuries ahead of its time, used it to encrypt a single manuscript, and left no other trace of the invention is not impossible, but it requires a set of assumptions that strain credibility. The third possibility, and this is the one that has gained the most traction among serious scholars in recent decades, is that the text is meaningless, that it was generated by a mechanical or procedural method designed to mimic the surface properties of language without encoding any actual information, that it is, in the technical sense, a hoax, not a fraud perpetrated for money, but an elaborate intellectual exercise, a philosophical experiment, or a demonstration of a technique for producing plausible-looking but contentless text. This hypothesis was first articulated in a rigorous form by the computer scientist Gordon Rugg of Keele University, who published a landmark paper in 2004 demonstrating that text, with statistical properties closely resembling those of the Voynich manuscript, could be generated using a simple device known as a card and grill, a sheet of cardboard with holes cut in it, placed over a table of syllables or letter combinations. By sliding the grill across the table and reading off the syllables visible through the holes, a user could produce large quantities of text that looked like language, followed Zipf's law, and exhibited the right frequency distributions, all without encoding any meaning whatsoever. Rugg's demonstration was not a decipherment, it was something more unsettling, a proof of concept. He showed that the Voynich text could have been produced without a language, without a cipher, and without a message, that the appearance of meaning could be manufactured mechanically from meaningless components. The implications were devastating. If Rugg was right, then the entire century of decipherment effort had been directed at a target that did not exist. The scholars had been trying to read a book that says nothing. The codebreakers had been trying to crack a code that encodes no message. Rugg's method was elegantly simple. He constructed a table of Voynich-like syllable components, prefixes, roots, and suffixes drawn from the character inventory of the manuscript, and arranged them in a grid. He then created a cardan grill, a card with rectangular windows cut in specific positions, and placed it over the table. The syllables visible through the windows formed words. By moving the grill to different positions on the table, he could generate new words. By stringing these words together, he could produce text. The resulting text had word-length distributions, character frequencies, and Zipf's law properties that closely resembled those of the Voynich manuscript. The entire process could have been performed by a 15th century craftsman using nothing more than a piece of parchment, a knife, and a table of syllables. No cipher, no language, no message. Just a mechanical procedure that produces the appearance of linguistic content from empty components. The card and grill was a real device in the 15th century. Girolamo Cardano described it in 1550 as a method for secret communication, a way of sending messages hidden within an apparently meaningless text. Rugg's innovation was to reverse the device's purpose. Instead of hiding a message within noise, the grill could generate noise that looked like a message. The reversal was conceptually simple, but historically explosive. If the Voynich manuscript was produced by this method, then it was not a cipher and not a language, but a third thing. A meaningless text designed to look meaningful, produced for purposes unknown. But here is the problem. Rugg showed that the text could have been produced without meaning. He did not show that it was. The card and grill method produces text that resembles the Voynich manuscript in some statistical respects, but not all. Subsequent analyses have identified properties of the Voynich text that Rugg's method does not reproduce. The text shows long-range correlations, statistical relationships between words that are separated by many intervening words, that are characteristic of meaningful language, and that are not produced by a card and grill. The text shows what linguists call contextual variation, the tendency for the same word to appear in different forms depending on its position in a paragraph or its proximity to other specific words. That is difficult to explain as an artifact of a mechanical generation process, and the text shows a consistent relationship between the illustrations and the words that appear near them, a relationship that suggests the words are, at some level, describing or labeling the illustrations. None of these observations proves that the text is meaningful, but they make it harder to dismiss as meaningless. The Voynich text is too complex to be easily explained as a hoax, too anomalous to be easily explained as a natural language, and too resistant to be easily explained as a cipher. It occupies a space that no other text in human history has ever occupied, a space between meaning and meaninglessness, between language and its simulation, between code and noise. And that space, as it turns out, is extraordinarily difficult to navigate. The specific anomalies that make the Voynich text so resistant to analysis deserve individual attention, because each one narrows the field of possible explanations and each one deepens the mystery. The first anomaly is the extraordinary repetitiveness of the text. Certain words, or what appear to be words, repeat with a frequency that far exceeds what is observed in natural language. The most common word in the Voynich manuscript accounts for roughly 4% of all word tokens. The text has several very common words that are close in frequency, creating a flatter distribution curve than is typical for natural language. This pattern is consistent with a text generated from a limited vocabulary, either because the underlying language has a restricted lexicon or because the generation method drew from a limited set of components. The second anomaly is the almost complete absence of what linguists call hapax legomena, words that appear only once in a text. In any natural language corpus of the size of the Voynich manuscript, a significant proportion of the vocabulary, typically around 40 to 60%, should consist of words that appear only once. The Voynich text has far fewer hapax legomena than expected. This is consistent with a text generated from a finite, closed vocabulary, a vocabulary that contains a fixed number of words, each of which is used repeatedly. It is less consistent with natural language, in which the vocabulary is essentially open-ended. The third anomaly is what scholars have called word initial and word final preferences. Certain Voynich characters appear almost exclusively at the beginnings of words, while others appear almost exclusively at the ends. This is not, in itself, unusual. Many natural languages have phonological constraints that limit which sounds can begin or end a word, but the Voynich preferences are unusually strong, far stronger than those observed in any known natural language. Some characters appear at the beginning of over 90% of the words in which they occur, and virtually never at the end. This extreme positional specificity is more consistent with a constructed system, a set of rules for combining elements into word-like units, than with the phonological constraints of a natural language. The fourth anomaly is the behavior of Voynich text at paragraph boundaries. The first word of a paragraph is, with high probability, different from the words that appear in the body of the paragraph. This is consistent with natural language, but the degree of the effect is unusually strong, suggesting that paragraph initial position is a more significant structural feature in the Voynich text than it is in any known natural language. These four anomalies, the repetitiveness, the shortage of unique words, the extreme positional preferences, and the paragraph initial effect, collectively paint a picture of a text that is structured like language, but is not quite language. It is too orderly to be random. It is too anomalous to be natural. It occupies a no man's land between meaning and meaninglessness that has no parallel in the history of textual analysis. And it gets worse, because the question of whether the text is meaningful is not the only question that defies resolution. The illustrations present their own set of problems that are, if anything, even more intractable than the textual ones. Consider the plants. Over 100 plants are depicted in the botanical section, and not one has been conclusively identified with a known species. This is extraordinary. Medieval herbals, even poorly drawn ones, can generally be matched to real plants by botanists who are familiar with the local flora. The plants in the Voynich manuscript have been compared to the flora of Europe, the Mediterranean, Central America, South Asia, and virtually every other region that has been proposed as the manuscript's place of origin. A few tentative identifications have been made. The botanist Arthur Tucker proposed in 2013 that several Voynich plants matched species native to Mexico and Central America, suggesting a New World origin for the manuscript. But these identifications have been disputed by other scholars and have not achieved consensus. The failure to identify the plants raises two possibilities. Either the plants are real but depicted so inaccurately or stylistically that they cannot be matched to known species, which is possible but unusual for a manuscript of this elaboration and apparent seriousness, or they are imaginary. If they are imaginary, then the manuscript is not a herbal in any conventional sense. It is something else. A work of fiction, a philosophical treatise illustrated with invented flora, or a hoax designed to look like a herbal without containing any actual botanical information. The astronomical diagrams are equally mysterious. Several circular charts in the manuscript appear to depict celestial objects, and some contain symbols that have been tentatively identified as zodiac signs. But the identifications are uncertain, and the overall design of the charts does not correspond to any known astronomical tradition. The arrangements of stars, the configurations of celestial bodies, and the organizational principles of the diagrams are unlike anything in the Western, Islamic, or Asian astronomical traditions with which scholars have compared them. Either the diagrams represent an unknown astronomical system, which is possible but would be a discovery of immense significance, or they are, like the plants, inventions. And the bathing section, the section depicting naked women in elaborate plumbing systems, is beyond comparison. Nothing like it exists in any known medieval tradition. It is not medical illustration, because the anatomy is too schematic and the procedures too fantastical. It is not alchemical allegory, because the symbolism does not match any known alchemical system. It is not erotic art, because the figures are depicted with a clinical detachment that is utterly devoid of sensuality. It is simply unique, a category of illustration that has no precedent and no parallel, created for a purpose that no one has been able to identify. The strangeness of the illustrations cannot be overstated, because it is qualitatively different from the strangeness of other medieval manuscripts. Medieval manuscripts are often strange. They contain bizarre marginalia, fantastical creatures, and imagery that defies modern interpretation. But their strangeness is always recognizable. A scholar who studies medieval manuscripts can, with sufficient expertise, identify the tradition from which a given illustration derives, the artistic conventions, the iconographic program, the textual sources that inform the imagery. The Voynich Manuscript defies this identification. Its illustrations do not derive from any recognizable tradition. They do not follow any known iconographic program. They are not crude or incompetent. The drawing is skilled, the compositions are careful, the use of color is consistent, but they are utterly disconnected from the visual culture of their time. The art historian and manuscript specialist Deborah Harkness has described the Voynich illustrations as orphaned, images that have no parents in any known tradition and no children in any subsequent one. They appear fully formed in the manuscript, and they disappear when the manuscript ends. There is nothing like them before and nothing like them after. This isolation is itself suspicious. In the normal course of cultural production, artistic traditions evolve. They borrow, they adapt, they influence, and are influenced by other traditions. An artistic style that appears from nowhere and leads to nothing is either an act of extraordinary originality or an act of deliberate invention, the creation of something new for a specific purpose. The zodiac-like diagrams in the astronomical section provide another tantalizing thread. Several circular charts contain figures that resemble, at first glance, the 12 signs of the Western zodiac: a bull, a ram, a pair of fishes, a scorpion. But the resemblance is imperfect. The figures are not in the standard order. The number of figures does not always match 12. Some figures do not correspond to any standard zodiac sign, and the charts themselves, the concentric rings of text and symbols that surround the central figures, do not follow any known astronomical or astrological convention. The zodiac signs, if that is what they are, appear to be embedded in a system that is either a variant of Western astrology that has not been documented elsewhere, or a completely independent system that merely shares some visual elements with the Western zodiac. The scholar Sergio Torresella, an expert in medieval herbals, has proposed that the Voynich manuscript may belong to a specific genre of Italian alchemical manuscripts, that deliberately employed obscure or invented imagery to protect trade secrets. Torricella has identified a small number of 15th century Italian manuscripts that share certain features with the Voynich, including unidentifiable plant illustrations and obscure symbolism, and has argued that the Voynich may represent an extreme example of this tradition. His hypothesis has the merit of placing the manuscript in a known cultural context, and explaining both the obscurity of the text and the strangeness of the illustrations as deliberate concealment rather than meaninglessness. But the hypothesis depends on an identification that cannot be proven without reading the text, and it does not explain the specific mechanism by which the text was rendered unreadable. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. If the text is meaningless, if it was generated by a Cardano grill or some similar method, then the illustrations should provide no additional information, because there would be no information to illustrate. But the illustrations are not random. They are elaborate, detailed, and internally consistent. They follow recognizable patterns. They are organized into coherent sections. They appear to relate to specific passages of text. This suggests either that the illustrations are genuine depictions of real or imagined subjects, created alongside a meaningful text that describes them, or that the creator of the manuscript went to extraordinary lengths to produce not just meaningless text but meaningless illustrations that look as though they are related to the text in a sustained act of deception that would have required months of dedicated effort. The effort involved is a critical point that deserves emphasis. The Voynich Manuscript is not a quick sketch on the back of a napkin. It is a substantial physical artifact, a book that required the preparation of over 100 calfskins, the grinding and mixing of multiple pigments, the ruling and pricking of hundreds of pages, and the sustained labour of writing approximately 170,000 characters, and painting hundreds of illustrations. The total time investment for a skilled medieval scribe working alone would have been at minimum several months and possibly over a year. If the manuscript is a hoax, it is the most elaborate and most labour-intensive hoax in the history of manuscripts. A hoax that consumed resources equivalent to a significant fraction of the creator's lifetime, that was never used to defraud anyone of money, and that was never claimed to be anything other than a mysterious book that no one could read. This is not the behaviour of a hoaxer. Hoaxers are economical. They produce the minimum amount of material needed to achieve their goal. Whether that goal is money, fame, or amusement, the Voynich manuscript is the opposite of economical. It is lavish, excessive, and absurdly over-engineered for a hoax. If it is a fake, it is a fake that cost more to produce than any genuine manuscript of comparable size, and it was produced for no identifiable purpose by a person who had no apparent motive. There is one additional physical detail that complicates the picture further. Careful analysis of the handwriting has identified what appear to be at least two distinct scribal hands in the manuscript, two different individuals who contributed to the writing of the text. The hands are similar enough in style to suggest that both writers were trained in the same tradition or were familiar with the same script, but they differ in subtle details of letter formation, pen pressure, and character proportion. The identification of multiple hands has been debated. Some scholars argue for a single hand with natural variation, but the majority view, based on detailed paleographic analysis, favours at least two writers. If the manuscript was written by multiple people, several implications follow. First, it suggests that the script was not the private invention of a single individual. It was a shared system, known to at least two people and presumably learnable by others. This makes the pure hacks hypothesis more difficult to sustain, because a hoax typically involves a single perpetrator who controls all aspects of the fabrication. Two hoaxers would need to coordinate their efforts, share the invented script, and maintain inconsistency across their respective contributions. A level of coordination that complicates an already implausible scenario. Second, it suggests that the production of the manuscript was a collaborative project, a sustained effort that involved planning, division of labour, and shared purpose. This is more consistent with the production of a genuine manuscript, a book intended to serve a real function, than with a one-off deception. The quire structure of the manuscript also reveals something about its production process. The manuscript's pages are organized into gatherings, groups of nested sheets folded together to form booklets that were apparently written and illustrated before being bound together. The order of the quires in the current binding may not reflect the original intended order, and some scholars have argued that pages or entire quires may be missing. The quire numbers, written in the margins in what appears to be a later hand, suggest that at least some reordering occurred after the original production. The implications for decipherment are significant. If pages have been lost or rearranged, then the text, as it currently stands, may not represent the author's intended sequence, and any analysis that depends on the sequential order of the text may be compromised. And so the core problem stands. The text cannot be read. It resists every known method of decipherment. It exhibits properties that are inconsistent with natural language, inconsistent with known ciphers, and inconsistent with meaningless generation. The illustrations cannot be identified. They do not correspond to any known tradition. They are too elaborate to dismiss as random, but too anomalous to interpret. The manuscript as a whole is too expensive to be a casual effort, too sophisticated to be a simple hoax, and too opaque to be a straightforward text. It is, in the most literal sense, a book that defies categorization, a book that exists outside every known framework for understanding what books are and what books do. The possibility that the manuscript is a genuine record in an unknown language or cipher has not been abandoned, despite the failures. In 2014, the applied linguist Stephen Bax of the University of Bedfordshire proposed a partial decipherment based on the identification of proper nouns, plant names and star names in the text. Bax argued that certain Voynich words adjacent to botanical illustrations could be matched to the names of plants in medieval Arabic, Latin, and other languages, and that these matches provided the first confirmed readings of individual Voynich words. His proposed readings were tentative, limited to a handful of words, and dependent on the correct identification of the illustrated plants, identifications that were themselves disputed. Bax died in 2017, leaving his work unfinished and his hypothesis unconfirmed. In 2019, the medievalist Gerard Cheshire of the University of Bristol published a paper claiming to have identified the Voynich language as Proto-Romance, an early form of the Romance languages, predating the differentiation of Italian, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. Cheshire's paper generated extensive media coverage, but was immediately and forcefully rejected by the scholarly community. The medievalist Lisa Fagin Davis, executive director of the Medieval Academy of America, described the paper as basically the academic equivalent of online conspiracy theories. The linguist Claire Bowen of Yale University noted that the proposed readings were so flexible that they could be used to extract almost any meaning from almost any text. Cheshire's decipherment joined the long list of confident claims that dissolve under scrutiny, a list that, at this point, is longer than many books. The pattern is consistent and instructive. A scholar identifies a plausible-sounding language or cipher. They produce readings that appear to make sense on selected pages. They publish. Other scholars examine the readings and find that they are too flexible, too dependent on ad hoc adjustments, and too inconsistent across the full corpus to be credible. The proposed decipherment is rejected. The cycle repeats. The cycle has repeated so many times that some scholars have begun to question whether the concept of decipherment is even applicable to the Voynich manuscript. The historian René Zandbergen, who maintains the most comprehensive online database of Voynich research, has argued that the manuscript may require not a single key but a fundamental reconceptualization of what kind of object it is. We keep treating the Voynich manuscript as a code to be cracked, Zandbergen has observed. But maybe it is not a code. Maybe it is something else entirely. Something for which we do not yet have a category. The real question is not what the Voynich manuscript says. The real question is what kind of thing the Voynich manuscript is. And that question, after more than a century of investigation, remains as open as the day Wilfrid Voynich first turned its vellum pages in an Italian villa and realized that he was holding something that no one in the world could understand. The history of attempted solutions to the Voynich manuscript reads like a catalogue of human ingenuity, applied to an immovable object. Each generation has brought its own tools, its own assumptions, and its own moments of apparent breakthrough. Each generation has been wrong. What follows are 5 investigations, 5 different approaches to the manuscript, each revealing a different dimension of the mystery, and each contributing, in its own way, to the growing realization that the Voynich manuscript may not be the kind of problem that has a solution. The first investigation is the linguistic analysis of word structure, the attempt to determine whether the Voynich text exhibits the internal structure of a natural language at the level of individual words. In the 1970s and 80s, the physicist and amateur linguist Jorge Stolfi of the University of Campinas in Brazil conducted one of the most detailed structural analyses of the Voynich text ever attempted. Stolfi observed that Voynich words appear to follow a rigid combinatorial structure, that each word can be decomposed into a prefix, a middle element, and a suffix, each drawn from a small, fixed set of character combinations. The prefixes, middles, and suffixes combine according to consistent rules, producing the full range of observed word forms. This observation, which Stolfi presented in a series of online analyses that became influential among Voynich researchers, despite never being formally published in a peer-reviewed journal, transformed the field's understanding of the manuscript's textual structure. Prior to Stolfi, most researchers had treated Voynich words as atomic units, indivisible wholes whose internal structure was not amenable to analysis. Stolfi showed that the words were, on the contrary, highly structured, that they were built up from smaller components in a regular, rule-governed way. The implications were twofold. First, the word-building rules were simple enough to be implemented mechanically. A table of prefixes, a table of middles, and a table of suffixes, combined according to a few positional constraints, could generate the entire observed vocabulary of the Voynich manuscript. This simplicity was consistent with a mechanical generation process, a Cardan grill or similar device, and inconsistent with the organic, irregular word formation processes of natural languages, in which words are formed through a combination of historical accident, borrowing, derivation, and compounding that produces vocabularies of great irregularity and diversity. Second, the word-building rules imposed strong constraints on which character sequences could appear in which positions within a word. The first character of a Voynich word was drawn from one set, the middle characters from another, the final characters from a third. These positional constraints were far stronger than anything observed in natural languages. In English, for example, the letter Q is strongly associated with word initial position, but it can appear in other positions as well. In the Voynich script, the positional constraints are nearly absolute. Certain characters appear in certain positions and virtually never elsewhere. This absoluteness is more consistent with a rule-based system than with a natural phonological system. This observation was significant because it suggested that the Voynich text was not structured like a natural language, in which words are formed through a combination of roots, affixes, and morphological processes that produce an essentially unlimited vocabulary. Instead, the Voynich vocabulary appeared to be generated by a finite combinatorial process, a grammar of word formation that produced a large but bounded set of possible words from a small set of components. This is precisely the kind of structure that a Cardan grill or similar mechanical device would produce. It is not the kind of structure that is found in any known natural language. Stolfi's analysis was refined and extended by subsequent researchers, including the French computer scientist Gabriel Landini, who applied cluster analysis and other computational techniques to the Voynich word structure data. Landini confirmed that the Voynich vocabulary has a strongly combinatorial character, that words are built from a limited set of components combined according to simple positional rules. He also identified what he called self-citation, the tendency of the Voynich text to repeat not just individual words but entire sequences of words, often with minor variations. This self-citation pattern is unusual in natural language, but is consistent with a text generated by a mechanical process in which the same template produces similar outputs on successive applications. Landini also discovered a curious phenomenon that he termed word adjacency constraints. In the Voynich text, certain pairs of words almost never appear adjacent to each other, while other pairs appear together with high frequency. In a natural language, word adjacency is governed by grammar. Certain word types can follow certain other word types, while other combinations are grammatically forbidden. The Voynich adjacency constraints are similar in form to grammatical constraints, but different in detail. They do not match the adjacency patterns of any known language. This could mean that the Voynich language has a grammar unlike any known language, which is possible but extraordinary, or that the adjacency constraints are artifacts of a generation process, rules built into the mechanism that produced the text, rather than rules of a genuine grammar. The adjacency constraints are among the strongest pieces of evidence against the simple Cardan-Grill hypothesis, because a simple grill operating on a single table of syllables would not produce systematic word-level constraints. A grill generates words independently. Each word is assembled from the syllables visible through the windows at a given position, without reference to the preceding or following word. To produce word adjacency constraints, a more complex generation method would be required, one that takes into account the current word when generating the next. This is, in modern terms, a Markov process, a system in which the probability of each output depends on the previous output. The question, then, is whether a 15th century creator could have implemented a Markov-like generation process without access to modern probability theory. The answer is, possibly. A craftsman who was sufficiently observant and sufficiently systematic could, through trial and error, develop a set of rules for combining words that produce text with the desired statistical properties. A table of word pairs, combinations that are allowed and combinations that are forbidden, would suffice. The resulting text would exhibit adjacency constraints, without the creator ever understanding the underlying mathematics. But the combinatorial structure of the Voynich vocabulary is not, by itself, proof of meaninglessness. Some natural languages, particularly agglutinative languages like Turkish, Finnish, or Basque, in which words are built by adding affixes to roots in a regular, predictable manner, produce vocabularies with a strongly combinatorial character. The question is whether the Voynich combinatorial structure is consistent with any known type of agglutinative language. Stolfi argued that it was not, that the Voynich structure was too rigid, too regular, and too limited in its productive capacity to match any natural language. But the argument depended on comparisons with a limited sample of languages, and it could not exclude the possibility that an unknown language, not represented in the comparison sample, might exhibit the same structure. The second investigation is the most technologically ambitious attempt to date. The application of deep learning and neural language models to the Voynich corpus. In 2016, a team at the University of Alberta used a recurrent neural network to analyze the Voynich text, seeking to identify the language behind the script by comparing the text's statistical properties to those of a database of over 300 known languages. The algorithm did not decipher the text. It produced a ranking of the languages whose statistical profiles most closely matched the Voynich text. The top-ranked language was Hebrew. The result generated headlines. Scientists use AI to decode Voynich Manuscript that were, to put it charitably, premature. The algorithm had not decoded anything. It had identified a statistical similarity between the Voynich text and Hebrew text, a similarity in character frequency distributions, word length distributions, and other surface-level statistical features. This similarity was suggestive but not conclusive. Hebrew is a Semitic language with a consonantal script, in which vowels are typically not written. This feature produces texts with certain statistical properties, short words, high character frequency for common consonants, that might coincidentally match the properties of the Voynich text without implying any actual linguistic relationship. The algorithm, like many machine learning systems, was very good at finding patterns and very bad at determining whether the patterns were meaningful. Subsequent analyses using more sophisticated neural models have produced different results. A study by the computational linguist Claire Bowen at Yale The university that actually houses the manuscript used Bayesian phylogenetic methods to test the Voynich text against a range of language families. Bowen's analysis was unable to place the Voynich text within any known language family with statistical confidence. The text was not consistently similar to any language group. Sometimes it matched one family, sometimes another, with no stable result. Bowen described the outcome as consistent with either an unknown language or a text that has been processed in a way that obscures its linguistic identity, or, as she carefully noted, a text that is not linguistically meaningful at all. The third investigation concerns what may be the most important clue in the entire manuscript: the relationship between the text and the illustrations. If the text is meaningful, if it describes, labels, or explains the illustrated content, then the relationship between words and images should be systematic. Specific words should appear near specific types of illustrations. The vocabulary used in the botanical section should differ from the vocabulary used in the astronomical section. The word distributions should correlate with the subject matter. This is, in fact, what is observed. The vocabulary of the Voynich text varies by section. Certain words that are common in the botanical section are rare or absent in the astronomical section, and vice versa. This sectional variation is one of the strongest arguments for the meaningfulness of the text, because a mechanically generated text, one produced by a Cardan grill, for example, would not be expected to vary its vocabulary based on the subject of the accompanying illustrations. A Cardan grill produces text from a fixed table of components. The text it generates is independent of any external content. For the text to vary with the illustrations, the writer must have been aware of the illustrations and must have adjusted the text accordingly. This implies either that the text describes the illustrations, which would mean it is meaningful, or that the hoaxer deliberately varied the text to match the illustrations, adding another layer of complexity to an already implausibly elaborate deception. The relationship between text and illustrations becomes even more suggestive when examined at the level of individual pages. In the botanical section, each page typically features a single plant accompanied by one or more paragraphs of text. The text on each page appears to be specifically about the plant depicted. The word distributions differ from page to page in a way that suggests each page discusses a different subject. Furthermore, certain short words that appear next to specific parts of the plant illustrations, near the roots, the leaves, or the flowers, may be labels identifying specific plant parts. If this interpretation is correct, then the text is not just generally related to the illustrations, but specifically descriptive of them, a relationship that would be extremely difficult to fake convincingly without a genuine descriptive vocabulary. The botanist Arthur Tucker and the information technologist Rexford Talbot published a paper in 2014 arguing that several Voynich plants could be identified as species native to the Americas, specifically to Mexico and Central America. Tucker identified what he claimed were depictions of sunflower, chili pepper, and various other New World species. His identifications, if correct, would have radical implications for the manuscript's origin, suggesting that it was produced in the New World, or by someone who had travelled there at a date that would make it one of the earliest European records of American flora. Tucker's identifications were controversial and have not been widely accepted. The plant illustrations in the Voynich manuscript are sufficiently stylized and ambiguous that multiple species can plausibly be matched to any given drawing. Other researchers have proposed entirely different identifications for the same plants, matching them to European, Mediterranean, or Central Asian species. The identifications depend heavily on which features of the illustration the researcher emphasizes and which they set aside. A drawing that Tucker interprets as a sunflower because of its large, round flower head can equally be interpreted as an artichoke, a daisy, or a purely imaginary plant by researchers who emphasize different features of the same image. The failure to identify the plants with confidence is itself a datum, a piece of evidence about the manuscript that constrains the range of possible explanations. In a genuine medieval herbal, the plants are depicted for a practical purpose, to allow the reader to identify them in the field or in the market. Even a poorly drawn herbal aims at recognition. The Voynich plants, if they are real, are drawn in a way that defeats recognition, which means either that the artist was extraordinarily incompetent, which is contradicted by the skill of the drawings, or that recognition was not the purpose. And if recognition was not the purpose, then the botanical section is not a herbal in the conventional sense, and the text that accompanies the plants is not a conventional description. The linguist Prescott Currier, a cryptanalyst who worked on the manuscript in the 1970s, identified a further dimension of this variation. Currier distinguished two distinct statistical profiles within the Voynich text, which he labeled Language A and Language B. The two profiles differ in word frequency, character distribution, and other statistical measures. Language A predominates in the first half of the manuscript, while Language B predominates in the second half. The two profiles correspond roughly, though not exactly, to the division between the herbal section and the later sections. Currier's discovery of two statistical languages within the manuscript has never been satisfactorily explained. If the text is a cipher, why would the cipher change partway through the book? If it is a natural language, why would the statistical profile shift so dramatically? If it is a hoax, why would the hoaxer vary the statistical properties of the generated text? Each hypothesis struggles with Currier's finding. The two-language phenomenon is consistent with the multiple hands hypothesis, the observation that at least two scribes contributed to the manuscript. If each scribe used a slightly different method of generating or encoding text, the result would be two statistical profiles in a single manuscript. But this explanation merely pushes the question back a step. Why were two people using different methods to produce the same kind of unreadable text? Currier's Language A and Language B distinction has been confirmed by every subsequent statistical analysis and remains one of the most robust findings in Voynich research. It is also one of the most underappreciated because its implications are profound. If two different people wrote the text using two different methods, whatever those methods were, then the text was not the spontaneous outpouring of a single creative mind. It was a coordinated production. Two people agreed on a script, agreed on a general approach, and then executed their portions of the manuscript independently, using slightly different techniques. This coordination implies communication, a shared understanding of the project's goals, methods, and standards. Two people collaborated to produce a text that neither we, nor apparently anyone else in recorded history has been able to read. The collaboration deepens the mystery because it doubles the number of people who possess the key. And yet the key has never surfaced. Neither collaborator left any record in any known script of what they were doing or why. The silence of the collaborators is itself evidence. Two people who could write in the Voynich script presumably could also write in conventional scripts, Latin, Italian, German, or whatever language they spoke in their daily lives. Yet neither left any note, any commentary, any marginal annotation in a known language that might explain the manuscript. Either they chose not to, maintaining the secrecy of the project with remarkable discipline, or any such notes have been lost. The former implies that secrecy was important to them. The latter implies that we are missing a piece of the puzzle that might, if found, unlock everything. The fourth investigation takes us from the text to the physical object and asks a question that is often overlooked in the rush to decipher. What can the manuscript's physical construction tell us about its origin? Codicological analysis, the study of the physical structure of manuscripts, has revealed several important facts about the Voynich manuscript that constrain the range of possible interpretations. The parchment was prepared using techniques consistent with Italian or Central European practice of the early 15th century. The ink, as noted earlier, is iron gall ink of a type common in the same period and region. The pigments used in the illustrations include several colours, greens, blues, reds, and browns, that have been identified through spectroscopic analysis as natural pigments consistent with 15th century European practice. The paint was applied in layers, with the outlines drawn first and the colour added later, a standard technique in medieval manuscript production. The parchment itself shows signs of reuse. Faint traces of earlier writing, partially erased, have been detected on some pages. This practice, known as palimpsesting, was common in the medieval period, when parchment was expensive and reuse was economical. The presence of palimpsest traces suggests that the manuscript was produced in an environment where parchment was available but not abundant, consistent with a modest workshop or a private scriptorium rather than a major institutional library. The pigment analysis conducted by the Macron Research Institute in the 1980s and supplemented by more recent studies has identified at least 6 distinct pigments in the manuscripts. Illustrations. The greens are derived from copper-based compounds, possibly malachite or verdigris. The blues are consistent with azurite. The reds include iron-based pigments. The browns are likely iron gall ink applied as a wash. The yellows include what appears to be lead tin yellow or a similar compound. The white highlights, where they appear, are consistent with lead white. All of these pigments are common in 15th century European manuscript production. None is exotic, expensive, or difficult to obtain. The palette is, in a sense, perfectly ordinary, the standard toolkit of a competent medieval illuminator. This ordinariness is itself informative. It places the manuscript's production within the mainstream of European manuscript culture, not at its margins. The creator was not using rare or expensive materials. They were using the same materials that hundreds of other scribes and illuminators across Europe used every day. This consistency makes the strangeness of the content even more jarring. The physical object is perfectly normal. The intellectual content is perfectly abnormal. The container is familiar. The contents are alien. One particularly significant codicological finding deserves special attention. In 2014, researchers at the Voynich Library discovered faint traces of what appeared to be text in a conventional alphabet, possibly Latin, on the last page of the manuscript. The traces were extremely faint, visible only under ultraviolet illumination, and their interpretation remains disputed. Some scholars have read them as names or phrases in Latin that might provide clues to the manuscript's origin or ownership. Others have argued that the traces are too faint and too ambiguous to support confident reading. If genuine Latin text is present on the manuscript's pages, even in trace form, it would provide the first direct connection between the Voynich text and a known language, but the connection remains unconfirmed, and the traces may be nothing more than ghost images from a text that was once stored adjacent to the manuscript. The binding is not original. The current binding dates to the 16th or 17th century, well after the manuscript was produced. This means that the current page order may not reflect the original arrangement. Some scholars have argued that pages or entire quires are missing, which would mean that the surviving manuscript is a fragment of a larger work. If significant portions of the text are missing, then any analysis based on the surviving corpus may be compromised. Patterns that would be visible in the complete work may be invisible in the fragment. The fifth investigation is the one that strikes closest to the heart of the mystery, the question of who created the manuscript and why. The most prominent candidate author is the Italian polymath Antonio Avellino, known as Filaretti, a 15th century architect and writer who is known to have been interested in cryptography and secret writing. But the evidence connecting Filaretti to the manuscript is entirely circumstantial, and no scholar has made a compelling case for his authorship. Other proposed authors include Roger Bacon, John Dee, Edward Kelly, Wilfrid Voynich himself, and an anonymous medieval physician, alchemist, or natural philosopher. None of these attributions has been substantiated. The most intriguing candidate, proposed by the historian Nicholas Gibbs in 2017, is not a single individual but a category, a medieval physician, compiling a handbook of women's health remedies. Gibbs argued that the Voynich Manuscript was a gynecological reference book, that the bathing scenes depicted therapeutic baths prescribed for women's ailments, and that the text consisted of abbreviated Latin medical terminology written in a conventionalized shorthand. His proposed reading was detailed and initially persuasive, but it was quickly challenged by medievalists, who pointed out that the abbreviations Gibbs identified did not match any known medieval shorthand system, that his readings were inconsistent across the manuscript, and that his identification of the illustrations relied on selective interpretation. The failure of the authorship question mirrors the failure of the decipherment question. Every proposed author requires a specific hypothesis about the purpose and content of the manuscript. Every hypothesis is testable only against the text, and the text cannot be read. The circle is closed. The author is unknown because the text is unknown. The text is unknown because the language is unknown. The language is unknown because the cipher is unknown, and the cipher is unknown because it does not behave like any known cipher. Each question leads to the next, and the last question leads back to the first. There is one more avenue of investigation that deserves detailed attention, because it represents perhaps the most creative approach to the Voynich puzzle, and because its results, while not conclusive, are among the most provocative in the entire history of Voynich research. In 2013, the physicist Marcello Montemurro of the University of Manchester and the theoretical biologist Damien Zanet applied a technique called semantic network analysis to the Voynich text. Their method involved mapping the co-occurrence patterns of Voynich words, recording which words tend to appear near which other words, and constructing a network that represented the statistical relationships between all words in the corpus. Montemurro and Zanet found that the Voynich text exhibited a pattern of long-range word clustering that is characteristic of meaningful text, and that is not produced by simple randomization, Markov chains, or card-and-grill methods. Specifically, they found that Voynich words cluster into groups that tend to co-occur in specific sections of the manuscript, a pattern that is consistent with topical organization in which different sections discuss different subjects using different vocabularies. This is exactly what one would expect in a genuine reference book. A herbal section would use plant-related vocabulary, an astronomical section would use star-related vocabulary, and it is difficult to produce artificially, without a conscious effort, to vary the vocabulary in synchronization with the illustrations. The Montemurro-Zanet study was published in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS One and attracted significant attention from both the scientific community and the popular press. Its conclusions were cautious. The authors stated that their findings were consistent with the hypothesis that the Voynich manuscript is a ciphered text, but did not prove it. They acknowledged that a sufficiently sophisticated hoax, one that deliberately varied the vocabulary by section, could produce similar results. But they argued that the degree of long-range clustering they observed would be extremely difficult to produce without genuine semantic content, because it required not just local variation, but global statistical coherence across the entire 240-page manuscript. The response from the hoax camp was predictable. Yes, it would be difficult, but not impossible. A clever hoaxer, armed with a card and grill and a set of different syllable tables for different sections, could produce exactly the pattern that Montemurro and Zanet observed. The debate, once again, reached a standstill. The data supported both interpretations. The tiebreaker did not exist. The circle has been spinning for over a century. It shows no sign of stopping. The cumulative weight of all these investigations, the word structure analysis, the neural language models, the text illustration relationships, the Courier two-language finding, the codicological analysis, the authorship investigations, the semantic network analysis, is paradoxical. Each investigation has added to our knowledge about the manuscript. Collectively, they have produced a detailed, multidimensional profile of the text's properties. And yet the central question, is the text meaningful, remains as open as it was in 1912. We know more about the Voynich manuscript than about almost any other medieval artifact, and we understand it less than almost any other medieval artifact. Knowledge has accumulated, understanding has not. The gap between knowing and understanding is the gap in which the Voynich manuscript lives. There is a moment, somewhere in the second or third year, of serious engagement with the Voynich manuscript, when a scholar stops looking for a solution and starts looking at the problem. The shift is subtle but profound. The question changes from "what does this say?" to "why can't I read this?" And the second question turns out to be far more interesting and far more important than the first. The deeper truth of the Voynich manuscript is not about its content, it is about its resistance. The manuscript resists decipherment in ways that are not merely difficult, but structurally anomalous. Ways that violate the fundamental assumptions on which all cryptanalysis and all linguistic analysis are based. These violations are not random, they are systematic, they form a pattern, and the pattern, when examined closely, reveals something unsettling about the nature of meaning, communication, and the limits of human understanding. Consider what the manuscript does to our assumptions. We assume that a text that looks like language is language. The Voynich text looks like language. It has words, sentences, paragraphs. It follows statistical distributions consistent with language, but it cannot be read as language. We assume that a cipher, however complex, can be broken if the analyst has enough text. The Voynich manuscript contains 170,000 characters, more than enough text to break any cipher known to the 15th century. But it has not been broken. We assume that illustrations, however stylized, can be identified by comparison with known artistic and scientific traditions. The Voynich illustrations cannot be identified. They exist outside every known tradition. Each of these failures, taken individually, is unusual but not unprecedented. There are other undeciphered texts. There are other unidentified illustrations. There are other mysterious manuscripts. But the Voynich manuscript combines all of these failures in a single object. It is simultaneously a textual mystery, a cryptographic mystery, a linguistic mystery, a botanical mystery, an astronomical mystery, and an art historical mystery. The convergence of all these mysteries in one artifact is what makes the Voynich manuscript unique, and what makes it so resistant to explanation. Any hypothesis that explains one aspect of the mystery tends to contradict another. A hypothesis that explains the text as a cipher cannot explain the illustrations. A hypothesis that explains the illustrations as real botanical subjects cannot explain the statistical anomalies of the text. A hypothesis that explains the text as a hoax cannot explain the labor and expense of the physical object. The manuscript is a knot that tightens with every attempt to untie it. Let that sink in. The Voynich manuscript may be the only object in the history of human intellectual endeavor that has become more mysterious with study rather than less. A century of investigation has not solved the mystery. It has deepened it. The more we learn about the manuscript's physical properties, its statistical characteristics, its provenance, and its cultural context, the fewer hypotheses remain viable, and the remaining hypotheses are increasingly extreme. Either the manuscript is a genuine text in an unknown language or cipher that is far more sophisticated than anything the 15th century was capable of producing, or it is a hoax of unprecedented scale, complexity, and purposelessness. Neither explanation is satisfying, neither explanation is comfortable, and neither explanation can be confirmed or ruled out with the evidence currently available. The philosopher of science Karl Popper argued that a hypothesis that cannot be falsified, that cannot, even in principle, be shown to be wrong, is not a scientific hypothesis. By this criterion, the question of whether the Voynich manuscript is meaningful or meaningless is not a scientific question. Both hypotheses are unfalsifiable with current evidence. The meaningful hypothesis cannot be falsified because the text might be in a language or cipher that we have not yet identified. The meaningless hypothesis cannot be falsified because a card and grill can produce text that mimics almost any statistical property of language. The two hypotheses are, in their current forms, empirically indistinguishable. They make the same predictions. They explain the same observations. They differ only in their assumptions about what is behind the marks on the page. Meaning or noise, signal or static, message or mirage. This is not science fiction. This is the actual state of Voynich scholarship in the 21st century. The finest analytical minds of the past 100 years have been unable to determine whether the most famous manuscript in the world says something or says nothing. The evidence is not merely insufficient, it is systematically ambiguous, structured in a way that supports both interpretations equally and resists any attempt to distinguish between them. The implications of this ambiguity extend far beyond the Voynich manuscript itself. The manuscript is, in a sense, a test of the limits of analysis, a boundary marker for what human intelligence, aided by the most powerful computational tools available, can and cannot determine from a body of evidence. The answer, in this case, is that it cannot determine the most basic question about the text, whether it means anything. This is a humbling conclusion. It suggests that there are categories of objects, categories of evidence, categories of human production that are inherently ambiguous, that resist classification, not because we lack the tools, but because the object itself occupies a space between categories that no tool can resolve. And it gets stranger, because the ambiguity of the Voynich manuscript may not be accidental, it may be the point. Consider the possibility, raised by several scholars, most notably the historian and philosopher Eamon Duffy, that the Voynich manuscript was created precisely in order to be mysterious, not as a hoax, not as an attempt to deceive anyone about its content, but as an object whose value lies not in its content, but in its opacity. In the world of 15th century European intellectual culture, where knowledge was power and secret knowledge was the greatest power of all, a book that no one could read would have had enormous value, not because of what it said, but because of what it seemed to say. A book that appeared to contain hidden wisdom, esoteric knowledge, alchemical secrets, medical miracles, would be worth a fortune to a collector like Rudolf II, regardless of whether it actually contained any of those things. The book's unreadability was not a flaw, it was a feature. The mystery was the product. If this interpretation is correct, and it must be emphasized that it is speculative, then the Voynich manuscript is not a code waiting to be cracked or a language waiting to be identified. It is a work of art, an artifact whose purpose is to provoke wonder, to suggest depths of hidden knowledge, to create the experience of standing before a mystery that is too deep for comprehension. The plants are unidentifiable because they were designed to be unidentifiable. The text is unreadable because it was designed to be unreadable. The manuscript is not a problem with a solution. It is a question without an answer, and the question, not the answer, is the point. This interpretation has the advantage of elegance. It explains the manuscript's resistance to decipherment without requiring an implausible cipher. It explains the unidentifiable illustrations without requiring an unknown botanical tradition. It explains the enormous labor investment without requiring a message worth encoding. It explains why the manuscript has defeated every analyst who has approached it, because it was designed to defeat them. The manuscript is not a lock for which the key has been lost. It is a door that was never meant to open. But the interpretation also has a devastating weakness. It is unfalsifiable. If the manuscript was designed to be unreadable, then the evidence of unreadability confirms the hypothesis. If the manuscript is eventually read, the hypothesis is disproven. But if it is never read, as seems increasingly likely, the hypothesis can never be confirmed because the absence of a reading is equally consistent with a genuine cipher that has not yet been broken, and with a designed unreadability that cannot be broken. The two explanations are once again empirically indistinguishable. The knot tightens. The Voynich manuscript is not the only object that has confounded the distinction between meaning and meaninglessness, but it is by far the most sustained and most elaborate. The history of art, literature, and philosophy contains many works that deliberately play at the boundary between sense and nonsense. The poetry of Lewis Carroll, the automatic writing of the Surrealists, the glossolalia performances of Pentecostal worship, the chance-based compositions of John Cage, but these works are situated within cultural contexts that explain them. Carroll was writing for children. The Surrealists were exploring the unconscious. Cage was challenging the definition of music. The Voynich manuscript has no such context. It exists in an explanatory vacuum, a work without a genre, without a tradition, without an audience, and without a purpose. The historian Mary D'Imperio, who worked at the National Security Agency, and who produced the definitive scholarly survey of Voynich research, a monograph titled The Voynich Manuscript, an elegant enigma published in 1978, concluded her study with a passage that remains the most honest assessment of the state of the field ever written. The Voynich manuscript, D'Imperio wrote, is a problem that has been attacked by the best minds in some of the most advanced analytical disciplines of the modern world. It has resisted them all. The question is whether the resistance is a property of the manuscript or a property of our methods, whether we lack the right key or whether there is no lock. 40 years later, the question remains unanswered. The methods have improved, the computers are faster, the databases are larger, and the manuscript is as unreadable as the day D'Imperio wrote those words. We will never know, and this must be stated with the full weight of its implications. Whether the Voynich manuscript says something or says nothing, we will never know whether it is the most elaborate intellectual fraud in history or the most impenetrable encoding of genuine knowledge. We will never know whether the plants depict real species from a lost herbal tradition or imaginary species from a creative mind. We will never know whether the bathing nymphs represent medical procedures, alchemical allegories, or pure invention. We will never know whether the astronomical diagrams map a real sky or an invented one. The manuscript withholds its secrets, not because we have not tried hard enough, but because the secrets may not exist, and we have no way of knowing. This is the deepest truth of the Voynich manuscript. It is not a mystery that resists solution. It is a mystery that resists the concept of solution itself. It occupies a space between meaning and meaninglessness that is, so far as anyone can determine, permanently indeterminate. The book is neither open nor closed. It is neither readable nor proven unreadable. It is neither genuine nor proven fake. It is a question that cannot be answered. Not because the answer is hidden, but because the question itself may not have an answer. And the most unsettling part, we may be doing the same thing right now. Our digital world is full of signals, texts, images, data streams, whose meaning is uncertain, whose authenticity is disputed, whose purpose is opaque. The Voynich manuscript is the medieval ancestor of the deep fake, the bot-generated text, the algorithmically produced content that fills the internet with material that looks meaningful and may not be. The manuscript anticipated, by 5 centuries, the fundamental problem of the information age, the problem of distinguishing between genuine communication and the simulation of communication. The problem has no solution. It had no solution in 1420. It has no solution now. The parallel between the Voynich manuscript and modern AI-generated text is not superficial. It is structural. Large language models, the technology behind modern text-generating artificial intelligence, produce text by predicting the next word in a sequence based on the statistical patterns of the words that preceded it. The output looks like language. It follows the statistical distributions of language. It exhibits Zipf's law. It produces paragraphs and sentences that are, on the surface, indistinguishable from text written by a human being. And yet, in a fundamental sense that philosophers and computer scientists continue to debate, the text produced by a language model does not mean anything. The model does not understand the words it generates. It does not have beliefs, intentions, or ideas. It produces the appearance of meaning without the presence of meaning, exactly as a Cardan grill produces the appearance of language without the presence of language. The Voynich manuscript may be the world's first language model, a system for producing text that mimics the statistical properties of real language without encoding any actual semantic content. If this is the case, then the manuscript is not a medieval curiosity, but a precursor, a 500-year-old anticipation of a technology that would not be independently developed until the 21st century. The idea that meaning can be simulated, that the appearance of communication can be produced without the substance of communication, is an idea that we are only now, in the age of artificial intelligence, beginning to grapple with in a systematic way. The Voynich manuscript suggests that someone in the 15th century already understood this idea and implemented it in vellum and ink. But the parallel also reveals the limits of the analogy. A modern language model generates text that is locally coherent. Each sentence makes sense in isolation, but globally incoherent. The text as a whole does not develop a consistent argument, narrative, or description. The Voynich text, by contrast, shows evidence of global coherence, the sectional vocabulary variation, the long-range word clustering, the apparent relationship between text and illustrations. If the text is a medieval language model, it is a remarkably good one, one that produces not just locally plausible text, but globally structured text that varies systematically with its context. This level of sophistication would be extraordinary for a 15th century hoax. It would also be extraordinary for a 15th century language or cipher. Either way, the manuscript exceeds expectations. And exceeding expectations is what the Voynich Manuscript does best. The vellum pages sit in their vault at Yale, patient and unreadable, as they have sat for 6 centuries. The text flows in its confident hand, from right margin to left, paragraph after paragraph, page after page, through herbs and stars and baths and recipes, saying nothing that anyone can understand, and everything that anyone can imagine. The manuscript does not need to be read. It has already done what it was made to do. It has made us wonder. And the wondering, not the reading, may have been the point all along. The history of the Voynich manuscript's reception illuminates this possibility in a way that the manuscript's content cannot. For 6 centuries, the manuscript has been valued enough to be purchased by an emperor, preserved by Jesuits, sold by book dealers, acquired by a major university library. It has been valued not because of what it says, but because of what it might say. Its value has always been prospective, based on the promise of hidden knowledge rather than the delivery of actual knowledge. The book has functioned, throughout its entire documented history, as a container of potential meaning, a vessel that is always full because it is never emptied, always promising because it is never fulfilled. This function, the function of provoking wonder without satisfying curiosity, is not unique to the Voynich manuscript. It is a function that has been served by objects and texts throughout human history. The Delphic oracle served this function. The prophecies of Nostradamus serve this function. The Zen koan serves this function. In each case, the power of the text or object lies not in its answer, but in its question, not in what it reveals, but in what it conceals. The concealment creates a space, a cognitive vacuum, that the mind of the reader rushes to fill. The meaning we find in a mysterious text is, inevitably, our own meaning, projected onto the blank surface of the unknown, shaped by our own desires, fears, and expectations. The Voynich manuscript is a mirror. What we see in it tells us more about ourselves than about the manuscript. This observation is not intended to diminish the scholarly effort that has been devoted to the manuscript. The effort is genuine, the methods are rigorous, and the questions are important. But the observation does suggest that the manuscript's power, its enduring fascination, its ability to attract generation after generation of investigators, may derive not from the information it contains, but from the information it withholds. A book that could be read would be a book. A book that cannot be read is an enigma, and enigmas are for the human mind irresistible. The Voynich manuscript has survived because it is unreadable. If Friedman had cracked it in 1945, if the text had turned out to be a perfectly ordinary herbal treatise in a perfectly ordinary cipher, the manuscript would be a footnote in the history of cryptography, studied by a handful of specialists and forgotten by everyone else. Its fame, its notoriety, its enduring grip on the public imagination, all of these are products of its resistance to understanding. The mystery is not a bug, it is a feature. The manuscript's value lies not in its content, but in its mystery. Remove the mystery, and you remove the value. This is a deeply counterintuitive conclusion for a culture that equates value with information, knowledge with understanding, and meaning with content. We are accustomed to thinking of books as containers of information, vessels whose value lies in what they hold. The Voynich manuscript suggests an alternative, that a book's value can lie in what it does not hold, in the space it creates for imagination and wonder, in the questions it asks, rather than the answers it provides. Whether this alternative was intended by the manuscript's creator, whether the opacity was deliberate or accidental, we will never know. The question, like every other question about the Voynich manuscript, leads to a wall of uncertainty that no amount of analysis can penetrate. The creator is anonymous, the purpose is unknown, the content is unreadable, and the manuscript sits in its climate-controlled vault at Yale, waiting, as it has waited for 6 centuries, for a reader who can do what no reader has ever done. The wait may be eternal, the question may be permanent, and the book, beautiful, strange, patient, and utterly, magnificently incomprehensible, may endure, unread and unreadable, for as long as there are people who are drawn to the things they cannot understand. The legacy of the Voynich Manuscript extends beyond the narrow world of medieval studies and cryptography. The manuscript has become a cultural symbol, a byword for the impenetrable, the unknowable, the permanently mysterious. It appears in novels, films, television shows, and video games. It has inspired artists, musicians, and writers. It has become a touchstone for discussions about the limits of knowledge, the nature of meaning, and the relationship between human beings and the texts they produce. The novelist Umberto Eco, himself a semiotician who spent his career studying the relationship between signs and meaning, was fascinated by the Voynich manuscript and referenced it in several of his works. Eco understood that the manuscript's power lay not in its content, but in its resistance to content, in the way it simultaneously invited and defeated interpretation. The Voynich manuscript, Eco observed, is the ultimate example of what I call the hermetic tendency, the belief that a text contains a hidden meaning that is more profound than its surface meaning, and that this hidden meaning can be extracted by the right reader using the right method. The manuscript confirms and defeats this tendency simultaneously. It confirms it because the text clearly looks as though it means something. It defeats it because the something it seems to mean cannot be extracted. Eco's observation points to a deep truth about the human relationship with texts. We are, as a species, meaning-making creatures. We see patterns in noise, faces in clouds, messages in random sequences. The Voynich manuscript exploits this tendency with devastating effectiveness. Its text is structured just enough to trigger our pattern recognition instincts, but not enough to satisfy them. It is the cognitive equivalent of an itch that cannot be scratched, a stimulus that provokes a response that never reaches resolution. The psychologist and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett has written about what he calls the intentional stance, the human tendency to interpret complex behavior as evidence of an underlying intention or purpose. When we see a text that looks like language, we automatically adopt the intentional stance. We assume that someone wrote it, that they meant something by it, and that the meaning can be recovered. The Voynich manuscript tests this assumption to its breaking point. The text looks intentional, the illustrations look purposeful, the manuscript as a whole looks like the product of a mind with something to say. But the something that was said, if anything was said, remains permanently beyond our reach. The intentional stance is triggered but not resolved. The assumption of meaning is activated but not confirmed. We are left in a state of permanent cognitive suspense, certain that the manuscript means something, unable to determine what. This state of suspense is, for many people, not uncomfortable but exhilarating. The Voynich manuscript's enduring popularity, its ability to attract not just scholars but general audiences, not just academics but enthusiasts and amateurs and conspiracy theorists and dreamers, derives from the pleasure of the unsolved. The manuscript offers what no solved mystery can offer: the permanent possibility of meaning. As long as it remains unread, it could contain anything. It could be a medical breakthrough. It could be a philosophical masterpiece. It could be the record of a civilization that has otherwise been lost. The moment it is read, if it is ever read, those possibilities collapse into a single, specific, inevitably disappointing reality. An unread book is infinitely rich. A read book is merely what it says. The Voynich manuscript has been infinitely rich for 6 centuries. It may remain so forever. And there is, in that permanence, something that is not quite tragedy and not quite triumph, something closer to the quiet, persistent, irreducible mystery of existence itself. The universe does not explain itself. The Voynich manuscript does not explain itself. And the human mind, caught between the desire for answers and the reality of silence, does what it has always done. It wonders. What does it mean for a book to be unreadable? The question is not as simple as it sounds. We use the word unreadable casually to describe texts that are boring or difficult or poorly written. The Voynich manuscript is unreadable in a different and more fundamental sense. It is unreadable in the same way that a locked door is unpassable, not because of any deficiency in the reader, but because the mechanism of access is absent. The key does not exist, or has not been found, or was never made. The distinction between these 3 possibilities is the distinction between tragedy, hope, and the most unsettling possibility of all, that the manuscript was designed to have no key, that it is a door that opens onto nothing, that the appearance of a room beyond it is an illusion painted on the surface of the door itself. The journey of this story has taken us from the physical object, its vellum, its ink, its pigments, its quires, through the intellectual history of its investigation, Friedman, Currier, Rugg, Montemurro, Rao, to the philosophical question at its core: what kind of thing is the Voynich manuscript? The answer, after more than a century of investigation, is that we do not know. This is not a provisional answer. It is not a placeholder, awaiting the breakthrough that will resolve the question. It is, as far as current evidence permits, the final answer. We do not know what the Voynich manuscript is. We do not know whether it is meaningful or meaningless. We do not know whether it records a language, a cipher, or noise. And we have no reliable method for determining which of these possibilities is correct. This conclusion is unsatisfying. It is supposed to be unsatisfying. The human mind craves resolution. It demands that mysteries have solutions, that questions have answers, that books have meanings. The Voynich manuscript denies all of these demands. It offers the form of a book, pages, text, illustrations, without the content of a book. It is a container without contents, a vessel without cargo, a message without meaning. Or it is a container with contents that we cannot access, a vessel with cargo that we cannot unload, a message with meaning that we cannot decode. The two descriptions are, at the level of current evidence, indistinguishable. The implications extend beyond the manuscript itself. The Voynich manuscript is a case study in the limits of human knowledge, a demonstration that there exist objects produced by human beings that other human beings cannot understand. This is a more radical claim than it might appear. We are accustomed to thinking that human products are, in principle, comprehensible by other humans. A book can be read, a machine can be understood, a code can be cracked. The Voynich manuscript challenges this assumption. It suggests that there is a category of human production, call it the permanently opaque, that resists comprehension, not because of the limitations of the reader, but because of the nature of the object. Some things made by humans may be, for other humans, forever beyond understanding. This category, if it exists, would have profound implications for epistemology, for cryptography, for the philosophy of language, and for our understanding of communication itself. It would mean that the space of possible human productions is larger than the space of comprehensible human productions. That humans can make things that other humans cannot, even in principle, understand. The Voynich manuscript may be the first confirmed member of this category. It may also be the last, but its existence, its stubborn, patient, 6th century existence, forces us to take the category seriously. The manuscript also forces us to reconsider the relationship between effort and understanding. We live in a culture that assumes effort produces results, that working harder, studying longer, and applying more sophisticated tools will eventually yield comprehension. The Voynich manuscript defies this assumption. A century of effort has been invested. The tools have improved beyond recognition. The number of scholars who have engaged with the problem has grown from a handful to thousands, and the result, measured in confirmed readings, identified languages, or deciphered passages, is zero. Not approximately zero, precisely zero. 100 years of cumulative scholarly labour, and not a single word can be read with confidence. This fact should give us pause. It suggests that there are problems, perhaps many problems, that do not yield to effort, no matter how sustained or how brilliant. The Voynich manuscript may be such a problem. It may be a permanent feature of the intellectual landscape, a mountain that cannot be climbed, a depth that cannot be plumbed, a code that cannot be broken. Not because we are not smart enough, not because we have not tried hard enough, but because the information required to solve the problem no longer exists. And no amount of effort can create information that has been destroyed by the passage of time. The connection between the opening of this story and this moment is direct and uncomfortable. We began with a book in a vault, a book studied by the greatest code breakers in history, a book analysed by the most powerful computers in the world, a book that has defeated every reader for 6 centuries. We end with the recognition that defeat may be permanent, that the book may be not a challenge waiting for the right mind, but a limit marking the boundary of what minds can know. The Voynich Manuscript is not a puzzle, it is a horizon, and horizons, by their nature, recede as you approach them. Are we making the same mistakes? The modern world is awash in information, in signals whose meaning is uncertain, whose authenticity is disputed, whose origin is obscure. Disinformation, deepfakes, algorithmically generated text, machine-produced images. The digital landscape is increasingly populated by objects whose relationship to meaning is as uncertain as the Voynich manuscripts. We scroll past them daily. We do not always know whether they are real. We do not always care. The Voynich manuscript in this context is not an anachronism. It is a prophecy, a 5-century-old preview of a world in which the distinction between meaning and its simulation has become the central problem of public discourse. The manuscript sits in its vault. The text flows across its pages. The plants bloom in their impossible forms. The nymphs bathe in their improbable pools. The stars circle in their unrecognizable constellations. And the question that has survived every answer, outlasted every explanation, defeated every codebreaker, remains. What does it say? Nobody knows. Nobody may ever know. And the manuscript, which has outlasted every reader who has tried to read it, and every scholar who has tried to explain it, waits with the patience of objects that do not know they are mysterious, that do not know they are keeping secrets, that simply exist, beautiful, strange and silent, in a world that has been trying for 600 years to understand them. There is one final reflection that this story demands, because it connects the Voynich manuscript to a question that is not about history or linguistics or cryptography, but about the human condition itself. We live in a world that we do not fully understand. We are surrounded by phenomena, natural, social, psychological, whose meanings are uncertain, whose causes are debated, and whose implications are unclear. We cope with this uncertainty by telling stories, by constructing narratives that organize the confusing welter of experience into comprehensible patterns. The Voynich manuscript is a story that refuses to be told. It is a narrative that resists narration. It is a pattern that looks like meaning, but may not be meaning. And our response to it, our century-long, obsessive, frustrated, magnificent response, reveals something deep about who we are. We are creatures who cannot tolerate meaninglessness. We would rather believe that the Voynich manuscript is a profound text in an unknown language than accept that it might be a meaningless fabrication. We would rather spend a lifetime searching for a key that does not exist than acknowledge that the door opens onto nothing. This is not a weakness. It is the source of all discovery, all science, all philosophy, all art. The refusal to accept meaninglessness is the engine that drives human understanding. The Voynich manuscript exploits this engine. It harnesses our drive for meaning and turns it into wonder. And the wonder, 6 centuries of sustained, unresolved, incandescent wonder, is the manuscript's true achievement. Not the text, not the illustrations, not the cipher, if there is one. The wonder. The silence continues. The wonder endures. In the Boynicki Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, there is a building made of translucent marble panels that filter the sunlight into a soft amber glow. The building was designed to protect rare books from the damaging effects of direct light while still allowing the natural illumination that makes reading possible. It is, in a sense, a building designed for the act of reading, a structure whose entire purpose is to create the conditions under which marks on a page can be understood. Inside this building, in a climate-controlled vault, sits a book that cannot be read. The Voynich manuscript has survived for 6 centuries. It has survived fire, war, neglect, and the enthusiastic handling of hundreds of researchers. It has survived the attention of the greatest codebreakers of the 20th century and the most powerful computers of the 21st. It has survived over 100 proposed decipherments, each one announced with confidence and each one subsequently abandoned. It has survived everything except comprehension. The answer to the title question, what actually is the Voynich manuscript, is the most honest and the most frustrating answer that scholarship can give. We do not know. The manuscript is either a genuine text in an unknown language or cipher, representing a body of knowledge that has been rendered permanently inaccessible by the loss of its key, or it is the most elaborate and sustained act of textual simulation in human history, a book that was created to look meaningful without being meaningful, for purposes that are as opaque as the text itself. Both explanations are consistent with the evidence. Neither can be confirmed, neither can be excluded. The manuscript exists in the space between these two possibilities, and that space shows no sign of collapsing into certainty. What we can say with confidence is that the manuscript is genuine. It was produced in the early 15th century on authentic materials by at least two skilled scribes. It is not a modern forgery. It is not a product of Wilfrid Voynich's imagination. It is a real medieval artifact, created by real medieval people, for a real purpose that we cannot identify. This much is settled. Everything else is open. The text may be meaningful. The statistical evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Some properties match natural language, others do not. The illustrations may depict real subjects. Some identifications have been proposed, none confirmed. The manuscript may have been produced for a specific audience, a patron, a buyer, a student, or it may have been produced as an end in itself. We do not know. What we do know is that the manuscript has had an effect on everyone who has encountered it. Wilfrid Voynich was consumed by it. William Friedman was haunted by it. Generations of scholars have devoted years of their lives to it. Millions of people have viewed its pages online and felt the same strange combination of recognition and bewilderment. The sense that the text is almost comprehensible, that the meaning is just beyond reach, that one more hour of study, one more comparison, one more algorithm might crack the code. It has not cracked. It may never crack. And the manuscript, patient, beautiful, silent, continues to do what it has done for 6 centuries. It makes people wonder. There is a plant on page 33 of the Voynich Manuscript. It has a thick, gnarled root system, a tall central stem, and a cluster of bell-shaped flowers at the top. The flowers are painted in a pale blue-green pigment that does not fade in 600 years. Next to the plant, in the confident hand of the Voynich scribe, is a paragraph of text. Perhaps 30 words, perhaps 40, depending on how the characters are segmented. The text is as legible today as it was the day it was written. Every character is clear, every word is distinct. The paragraph is a perfect specimen of the Voynich script, neat, regular, and completely incomprehensible. The plant does not exist, or if it does, no one has identified it. The text cannot be read, or if it can, no one has read it. The manuscript contains the text and the plant and the relationship between them, a relationship that was clear to the scribe and is opaque to us. The meaning is there, on the page, in the ink, in the exact configuration of characters that the scribe chose, in the exact shape of the flowers that the artist painted. It is right there, and we cannot reach it. The vellum endures, the ink endures, the mystery endures. And the book that no one can read, the book that has defeated every reader who has tried, sits in its vault in New Haven, Connecticut, in a building made of marble and light, waiting for the reader it was written for. That reader has not arrived. 6 centuries of readers have come and gone. The manuscript has outlasted them all. It will outlast us too. And when the next generation of scholars approaches it, armed with tools we cannot imagine, methods we have not invented, questions we have not thought to ask, the manuscript will be waiting, patient, silent, unread. There is a certain majesty in this endurance, a grandeur in the manuscript's refusal to yield. It is not the grandeur of a monument or a mountain. It is the subtler grandeur of a question that remains perpetually open, a doorway that never closes because it was never opened, a conversation that continues because it was never finished. The Voynich Manuscript is the longest unfinished conversation in human history, a 6th-century exchange between a book and the world of readers who have tried and tried again and failed again to hear what it is saying. The conversation will continue. New technologies will be developed. New analytical methods will emerge. New scholars will arrive, fresh and optimistic, armed with the conviction that they will be the ones to crack the code. Some will come close enough to feel the meaning lurking just beneath the surface of the text, close enough to sense the shape of the message without grasping its content. And then they will encounter the same wall that every predecessor encountered, the same statistical anomalies, the same structural ambiguities, the same maddening combination of order and opacity, and they will either persevere or move on, leaving the manuscript as they found it. Beautiful, strange, and unread. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the Voynich manuscript does not need to be read in order to fulfill its purpose, whatever that purpose was. Perhaps its purpose is simply to exist, as it has existed for 6 centuries, a permanent provocation to the human mind, a standing invitation to wonder, a monument to the irreducible mystery at the heart of all communication. We write because we want to be understood. We read because we want to understand. The Voynich manuscript occupies the space between these two desires. The space where writing and reading fail to connect, where the message is sent but never received, where the voice speaks but is never heard. That space is not empty. It is full of 6 centuries of human effort, human curiosity, human frustration, and human wonder. The manuscript has given us all of these things. It has not given us its meaning. And the meaning, if it exists, endures. Locked in ink on vellum, preserved against time, waiting for a reader who speaks the right language, holds the right key, and understands the right question. The pages turn, the text flows, the plants bloom, the stars circle, the nymphs bathe, and the words, those maddening, beautiful, impossible words, say what they have always said, something that no one alive can understand. The book endures, the silence endures, and the distance between the two, the distance between endurance and understanding, is the most beautiful and the most mournful mystery in all of human writing.